Want to turn our attention to, well, another issue that spans a couple countries here, and that is this, new Cold War style atmosphere, especially as it is playing out vis-a-vis, the high tech world and engineers and other people of that ilk, if you will. And we're very happy to be joined as we continue the show by KJ No, who's a peace activist, scholar on the geopolitics of Asia, and an organizer with Pivot to Peace. KJ, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. And, I want to start here with Merrick Garland's press conference. I guess that was towards the end of last week. And, really, it was this huge production, really, in the DOJ that seemed designed to create this sort of scare tactic attitude, well beyond just the issue he was addressing. But, I know a lot of people heard it, maybe some didn't. What exactly was he alleging at that press conference? And what are the implications of what seems to be an aggressive attempt to demonize people, Chinese people or people of Chinese descent who are working in certain fields?
Well, I think there are a bunch of cases involved there. There are at least three distinct cases. They have to do with charges of obstruction of a criminal case. They also have to do with charges of foreign nationals attempting to procure sensitive technological information and interfere with protests. And then there are another two that have been arrested and five that have been charged over harassment of Chinese Americans or American citizens of Chinese descent who were being apparently harassed to return. But I think the key thing to note in this announcement is first the extraordinary firepower that they brought to this announcement. It's not normal for the Attorney General and the Assistant Attorney General and the FBI chief to come out and announce some kind of prosecution. Usually that job falls to a district attorney. And so just the extraordinary kind of theatricality around it lets you know that this is highly, highly political. I think the other thing to note about this is that for example, the first case, which is really about the obstruction of a criminal investigation relating to Huawei, they don't mention Huawei, but essentially they're bringing up the Huawei case back up on the screen. The allegation is that two Chinese officials tried to bribe some U.S. official to get information about testimony and about witness lists. Now, that seems very absurd to me because first, the Chinese strategy on Huawei was diplomatic pressure. It didn't have to do with a legal strategy. And secondly, even if it came down to a court case, witness lists and witness testimony have to be shared with the counterparty. So it's kind of very, very suspect that somebody would have gone to such extraordinary extent to get information which would have been released anyway. And to add on top of it, these are cases that can never be prosecuted. They're purely symbolic or rhetorical cases because the U.S. is not going to be able to extradite a Chinese official and then bring them to stand case. So in that sense, these charges are neither provable nor disprovable. And when something is neither provable or disprovable, you have to understand that it's either a fantasy or a doctrine of faith. It has nothing to do with reality. I can say that Martians are interfering with our government and indict those Martians, but that does not mean that is true because it's neither provable nor disprovable. And I think on that level, we are no longer dealing with reality, but really we're dealing with propaganda and doublespeak.
Okay, so in that sense, then what was the point of this? Is this part of the broader U.S. campaign, years-long campaign, to try to sabotage Huawei? And then why? Like, why? Can you break out or lay out, for our audience, what the purpose of all of this actually is?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think the first thing we have to note is timing. And this is timed to coincide with the end of the 20th National Party Congress in China. And a lot of these statements are directed directly against the statements that were made during the second 20th Party Congress. That is to say, quote unquote, non-interference and win-win, etc., and sovereignty, all of these things. This is a direct and political rebuttal of that. It's not a strong rebuttal. In fact, I would say that it doesn't function as a rebuttal at all because it's so weak. And the case itself is depicted in such cartoonish terms that I have to wonder really about the kind of prose and the language skills. I learned English as a second language, but to say something like the our agents thwarted the persistent threat by the agents of the PRC. I mean, that's a level of cartoonish prose. I mean, the only thing missing from that is the word dastardly. So I think that it is clearly a strongly political statement. But more than that, it's time to refute the CPC 20th National Congress (NPC). It's also designed to create more justification for the semiconductor sanctions by pointing out that anything that a private corporation does is always backed up by Chinese government officials. Therefore, there's that constant enmeshment between the government and corporations. And then I think the third thing, which may be a little bit of a stretch, is that it may have to do with the bolstering of a U.S. A prosecutor. This is the DA who prosecuted An Ming-hu has been promoted to U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Tennessee, and that may also be designed to bolster his case because there's such an extraordinary outcry against his appointment because he was the one who created this utterly fraudulent case against An Ming-hu, a Chinese researcher.
And I'm glad you brought up that last point, KJ, because, this is, I can certainly remember it going back to the Clinton administration, but I don't know what else to call it other than sort of racist element of what's being approached to researchers both from China, people who are, Chinese American people, and this attempt to throw suspicion on them that we've seen kind of accelerated by the most recent element of the chip war, if you will, which is that any American or anyone who holds permanent residency or I think any other sort of legal immigration status who is working, in this industry with Chinese companies, can have that taken away from them, essentially can be banned from the country. And I mean, it seems to me that it's just designed to cast it's designed certainly to hobble China, but I think it seems to me to just be designed to cast aspersions on, a whole race of people working in one industry. I don't know what they're seeking to accomplish with that, but it does seem to be deeply pernicious.
Well, it's a form of enforcing, what has now become researching while Chinese. Just like driving while brown or black is a de facto crime, researching while Chinese has become a crime. And so all Chinese researchers, scientists, engineers are currently under this shadow of doubt. Prior to this, there was the China Initiative, which, according to the FBI director, they were opening a case against a Chinese person every 10 to 12 hours. They claim that the China Initiative has gone away, but clearly it is continuing under different forms. And people have asked about this recent declaration by the Attorney General and asked them, what's the name of this, project that you have where you're going after, Chinese people? And they say, well, there is no name. The China Initiative is over. But with the same breath, they say, we will not relent in our persecution or prosecution of Chinese. So once again, the doublespeak. All of this ties into the fact that this is designed to create fear, hatred, and loathing against Chinese people. And it is part of the information warfare that is being waged against China as this subkinetic or prekinetic dimension of ongoing war. So the hybrid war involves lawfare, legal warfare, and that ties into this information warfare, which is about tarring, delegitimizing, and pointing out the Chinese are dirty, dastardly, and deceitful. They're part of the jungle. They're not part of the garden. We have to keep them out.
And so much of this is tied up in a fear in the U.S. of China becoming more powerful technologically and economically, right? Like so much of this Cold War isn't just ideological. A lot of it is based in material reality of China's rise as this economic powerhouse that is building all of this technology, developing all of this technology that I believe, there was all this fear just a few months ago about China's semiconductors will soon outpace those that are produced in Taiwan, for example. So in many ways, this Cold War is in fact a technological war. Can you talk about the significance of China and its development capacity when it comes to things like, I'm not an expert in this stuff, so I might say words that sound silly or juvenile or like a little ignorant, but the issue of semiconductors comes up a lot. The issue of like chips, right? We don't want Huawei. Like one of the reasons that Huawei is always under attack is because of how it's able to develop chips. And the US is constantly saying, oh, China stole this from us. Like we developed it. And then Chinese companies stole it. And that's why they even have this technology. But is it true, in fact, that a lot of this is just about the fact that China is at this pace going to have more advanced technology than the US or its allies might in the coming years?
It does. China does have more advanced technology in certain areas, quantum computing, 5 and 6G networks, high-speed rail, etc. There are many areas in which China is overtaking the United States, despite having, 1/5 of the per capita GDP. So China is developing in leaps and bounds. Its academies are extraordinary. It is currently ranked number one in high quality scientific research publication. It's number one or two in patents. It's the most sought after place for scientists to travel and work in. Just last year, I think 1,400 Chinese scientists left the United States and decided to go to work in China because of all this, persecution. But I think you're absolutely correct. The tech war is indistinguishable from the economic war, which is designed to take China down, to prevent China from developing and modernizing on its own terms. Just very briefly, we have to understand in the post-World War II era, the majority of countries that were able to break out of the neocolonial trap and become developed, there are only about half a dozen of them. And the majority of them are their capitalist show ponies like Taiwan and South Korea, which were given extraordinary exemptions, or their sui generis city-states like Singapore, or their tax havens or petro-states. China is the only country that has broken out of colonization and become a developed state on its own terms. And it's done it in a way where modernization does not mean becoming more capitalist or more Western, but it's developing on its own terms. The US cannot tolerate that, and it cannot tolerate that example, and it cannot tolerate China becoming a kind of center of gravity or a different pole of development that other countries can model, connect with. And so this is why this attempt to literally to prevent China's development, destroy its economy, is taking on such extreme measures. And you mentioned a little bit earlier that it is now a crime for any American to be working at a Chinese company, or even a green card holder to be working at a Chinese company. I mean, that is an extraordinary extraterritorial overreach. And I think it does away with any notion that we have of freedom of choice, of freedom of conscience, of freedom of association. So I think these are extraordinary times, and they speak to both the harshness, the deliberateness, but also, in a certain sense, the desperation of the United States as it seeks to prevent China from moving up the production scale.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the desperation and final piece here. I mean, because I think many have argued that the strategy is backfiring. That ultimately, China is just trying to doing more to develop its own capacity since it's being shut out of so many areas by the United States, and that exactly what they hope to accomplish, they will fail, and that rather than focusing on the U.S.'s own capacities, just trying to stop China, is actually maybe helping them accelerate and leapfrog the U.S. because of the extra effort.
I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, anytime, this has been an ongoing process for a very, very long time. Anytime China is shut out of a technological field, it simply develops its own capacity and then surpasses the countries that were shutting it out. We can see this in the space station. China was forced out of the space station. They built their own. And they sent a rover to Mars on a single shot that is unheard of in the history of aeronautics. And they sent, and they also explored the far side of the moon. So these are just extraordinary accomplishments that China is going from strength to strength. Currently, it's understood that China does not have the capacity to build the most advanced chips at the current moment, especially those related to AI. And very advanced computing of 7 nanometers and below. But the fact is, China still has a very, very large capacity within and of itself. It spends $400 billion buying chips from other countries. It can simply turn those funds to itself. And if I may give you an analogy, it's a kind of a, if you will, if we think of microchips as being similar to potato chips, it's true that the U.S. holds the franchise on the potato chips, but it's clear that China has the potatoes, that is to say, the raw materials, and Russia has the oil. So it's not as simple as people think it is. The supply chain is complex. China has tremendous internal capacity, and I think that ultimately, over the long term, China is going to come out ahead, and the U.S. is going to see that there's tremendous blowback from these very, very foolish, short-sighted bans.
KJ No, as always, we really appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.